Well, I can't tell you how grateful I am that you're here on this dark and stormy night. And as I came up in the elevator, wondering if anybody would show up, I thought of a story I once heard about Orson Welles, who went to Milwaukee one night, and there was a terrible, terrible snowstorm. And he was supposed to speak at some huge theater downtown. Everyone had told him they had filled the theater. Everybody wanted to hear Orson Welles speak in Milwaukee. And he looked out, and there were 4 or 5 little old ladies in the 3rd row, and that was it. Even the person who had organized the event didn't show up, and he said, "Isn't it a pity?" Oh no, he said, "I'm Orson Welles. I'm an actor, I'm a poet, I'm a screenwriter, I'm a director, I'm an author of books. Isn't it a pity that there are so many of me and so few of you?" So I'm really grateful that you're here. I came in from New York yesterday. I came in from 60 Minutes, which I love. I've had a glorious 8 years there so far and hope to have many more. I love 60 Minutes because working with journalists of that high caliber elevates your own work, as many of you know. I love it because the stories are still the same kind of hard news journalism that we were doing 20 years ago. And I love it, and I confess this to you. I tell you off the record, it's made me younger. But then again, if you'd get younger if you worked with guys that old too. So it's gotten to the point that Morley always says it would be a conflict of interest if we did a story on Medicare. So stay away from that. The only drawback, of course, is that we're not a daily show. And I, who have covered every presidential scandal for the last 25 years, am not covering this one. I'm not sure that's such a bad thing, observing as I have been from a distance. But it's a hot time in Washington, and I'm not here, and that's always makes you wonder. As Sean said, I start my book with Watergate, which was the very first story I covered when CBS hired me. Actually, the first line of my book is that I was born on my 30th birthday. And CBS hired me that year, and I was born. There's no question about it. And I got here, and as Sean told you, they gave me Watergate to cover. I was intrigued the other day to see Bill Sapphire. I'm sure you all saw the column where he asked, he kind of redid it again today, asked how come President Clinton is so popular, or there's so much loyalty. Well, my recollection of Watergate is that Nixon was popular throughout most of it. Remember? Months and months and months, years of a pounding on this story, an unrelenting drip, 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 and his popularity stayed pretty high. Of course, the economy spun out, and the evidence became pretty convincing that he had subverted institutions of the government to cover up the break-in. And of course, it did fall off at the very end. One of the things that I concentrate on in my book, is, of course, the impact of television, not only on politics, but on life in general, and how we judge our public officials and our leaders on television, how television changes the way we see them. And I have been intrigued watching this scandal with what I like to call the game faces that the Clintons put on, and what that is, what kind of a signal we're reading from that when we watch this on television. There they are, showing us not a scintilla of agony, pain, guilt, remorse. And in a funny way, it's a subliminal signal to us that this is not a big deal. And I believe it's one of the reasons, Mr. Sapphire, that the public has not, public outside of Washington, has not risen up and said this is the most horrible thing that's ever happened to us, because the Clintons are continually sending visual images by their game faces that not to worry. We're okay. Lean back. This is not the most consequential thing that's ever happened. This is not the trial of the century, because we're not concerned. Television and the faces that we read on television of our leaders contribute to our judgments about them and what we think about them. I go back again to Watergate. It's February 14th, 1974, 6 months before Nixon is driven from office, before he has to go through a trial like this one. And it was Pat Nixon's birthday. And the maitre d' at Trader Vic's, now I understand Trader Vic's is finally closed down, right? Someone just told me that. But Trader Vic's at the Hilton Hotel, the maitre d' calls CBS to leak the story that the Nixons were coming to dinner. I get that. The Nixons were coming to dinner. Now, this was at a particularly intense time of the media in general's reporting of the Watergate scandal. The president was really hunkered down in the White House. We had not seen him for weeks, and we hadn't really heard much from him. And so this was kind of a nifty little scoop. So they sent me because it was night and it was cold, and of course, still the youngest kid in the office who hadn't learned how to say no yet. So I went, and the only other reporter there was Helen Thomas. So she took me under her wing, and she said, come on, we'll get a table, and we'll get a clear view of what they're doing, and we'll read their faces, and we'll get a nifty little story. So we do. We get a table right next to theirs, actually. And remember, Trader Vic's had those huge rattan chairs, kind of like thrones. Well, the president was in a throne, and Mrs. Nixon at the other end had a throne, and in the middle, Watergate buffs. Wait till I tell you who was in the middle. B.B. Rebozo. And so they're eating, and we're writing down. They're eating spare ribs and, you know, what they've ordered. And we're kind of giggling at this great nifty little thing that we've gotten. And they look kind of jolly. And we see they're getting the check. So we scurry outside. If you've ever been there, they had an escalator. Go up the escalator, and we open the door. 50,000 cameras. We were so miserable. Not only that, the Nixons came up right after us, and the crowd of men, Helen and I was still the only two women there, jostled us and pushed us out to the sides. And pretty soon, as the president arrived, Helen and I were at the back of the pack and couldn't hear a word. And the press corps surrounded the president, the cameras, all the reporters, and began to shout questions because we hadn't been able to ask him a question in so long. And there Helen and I are, with our great scoop at the back of the pack, and we turn around, and guess who's right there, also pushed to the back of the pack? The First Lady of the United States, Pat Nixon, in her little cloth coat, freezing to death. And she said to us, isn't this amazing? He took me out to dinner on my birthday at the height of the worst time of his life, and her eyes fill up with tears, and she said, I just can't believe he would do this for me. And I'm sitting there thinking, after what he's put you through for the last 2 years and your birth. But my point is that there was no artifice. We used to call her Plastic Pat. But here she's talking to two reporters, and she just couldn't hide it. She couldn't hold it in. And she was gushing it out to us that the tears were coming because he had done this one small little thing that you would have expected anybody to do at the height of what had been torture for her. And I was thinking, in remembering that night, how much the Clintons hide everything from us. And I was thinking, would Hillary give us anything if we were caught standing next to her at the back of the pack? Of course, she wouldn't be at the back of the pack, ever. But if it happened, we'd see nothing even close up, even in a small circle. The Clintons have their faces on, I believe, almost all the time, except when the doors close at the White House. And I wonder if it's something that the television age has brought on, and that it's something that they have been forced because of this constant fishbowl intrusion of the television age, or whether that's the Clintons. I don't know the answer. Anyway, the book, Reporting Live, I've been told by my publisher I should say that about 25 times tonight. The book, Reporting Live, is in part about television and how it's changed our politics and how it's changed the way we choose our leaders. It's also about the presidents I covered. I start with Nixon, and I was the White House correspondent when Jimmy Carter was there, when Reagan was there for 2 terms, and then George Bush. And it's also about my family. And if I were being honest, and a movie were to be made about this book, it would be a story about a girl and the presidents, a girl and her mother, and a girl and her hair. Because I confess that I talk a lot about trying to keep my hair in place while I was a White House correspondent. But tonight, I won't do that to you. Tonight, I'm going to talk about how television imparts information. So go back for a minute to President Clinton's grand jury testimony. Everyone saw in that testimony what they wanted to see in it. So if you were a person who was opposed to President Clinton, didn't think he was a good president, then what you saw, and I'm not going to mince around here, you saw a weasel who was dodging and darting and arguing over every answer and every question, and you basically saw an evader who was a finagler. But if you were disposed to like him, if you were in his corner, then you saw someone who was answering reasonably. Yes, he didn't always give a complete answer, but it was reasonable, and when he chose to be a little difficult, it was because we thought, or you thought, whichever side you were on, that the question was inappropriate, and you ended up with a positive feeling and a sense that he was believable. So as we always do when we watch television, we bring our prejudices into it, and we read faces, and we get an emotional reaction to what we're seeing. It's often more a Rorschach test of us than it is of the person that we're watching. I've just been fascinated by this sort of emotional dimension to television for years and years. I used to watch the Reagans when they left the White House almost every Friday to go to Camp David. The helicopter would be out on the South Lawn. They'd come out. Nancy would have the dog sort of pulling her along a little, hat box. Reagan beside her, head chuckle, sort of touching her arm, and they'd give each other that look. And it was a vignette, and you saw it on television. You saw it once a week, and it said, "Oh, God, what a loving couple. Aren't they adorable? Great family people." We knew they didn't talk to their children. We knew that. We knew they didn't know their grandchildren. In fact, we were a little bit appalled by that. But that didn't seem to have anything to do with our real judgment that they were great family people, because that picture was so compelling. And it sent a message, and we bought it in our mind's eye, and somehow that picture goes somewhere where we form judgments. You could not convince anybody in America that they weren't great family people. I was there, and I know. Television grips our judgments in an insidious way. I thought that Clinton won re-election in 92. Well, obviously you're going to tell me, no, come on, he won because of the economy, and that's a big part of it. It's the economy, stupid. But he also won because he was so much better on television than Bob Dole. And when you saw Bob Dole on television, a lot of people said in this funny judgment place, you know, he doesn't really look or sound the way we want our president to look and sound. He shouted too much on the cold medium, and he didn't have that soft, mellifluous voice that both Reagan and Bill Clinton have. And the voice and how we hear the quality of it makes a difference in our judgments, too. And here's another factor. Now, don't tell me that this is small and silly. I already know it's small and silly, but it's a factor anyway. It's called the blink factor. Now, some guy who was getting his PhD decided that he would do a paper on how many times the presidential candidates batted their eyelashes during the presidential debates. And he did this because television experts tell us that rapid eyelash batting on television, and probably also just when you're communicating with someone in a room somewhere, rapid eyelash batting conveys shiftiness and untrustworthiness. And so this PhD candidate sat there and counted the number of eyelash bats a minute. Now the experts, I'm not making this up, who could? The experts tell us that the normal number of bats a minute on television, I don't know where this number comes from, 31 to 50. Not 30 to 50, but 31 to 50 bats a minute is normal. So Clinton, this is in the two debates, the average of the two debates. Clinton batted 99 times a minute, okay? Bob Dole, you're not going to believe this, 147 bats a minute. Now, I've seen Bob Dole a trillion times on television after I read this. He bats his eyelashes. I see him he's on almost every Sunday somewhere. The guy does that, and he's not, you know, he does it whatever he's talking about. So he's not being evasive, he's not being tricky, he's bats his eyelashes. He talks about Viagra, and he bats his eyelashes. You know, but nevertheless, the signal to the viewer, the subliminal signal, apparently, is that that he's conveying this sense of untrustworthiness. So these little things, and the experts study these things, make a difference in what we think of people we see on television. And I've also discovered that the camera loves and hates as if it were a person. And you can't always tell ahead of time who it's going to love and hate. And this was a lesson to me in 1988, right after George Bush was elected president, because Dan Quayle, the vice president-elect, granted me his first interview after the election. You will remember, because it's hard to forget, that poor Dan Quayle, during the campaign, couldn't do anything right. And every time he came before the cameras, he managed to put his foot in his mouth, so that he became a running joke. So much so that by the end of the campaign, the Bush people decided that the best place for him to speak were in towns of populations with 3 to 1,000 people with names that ended in forks. So he would speak at Small Forks or Big Forks, South Dakota, or, but he would go where there was no television. And so we hadn't heard from him for quite a while when I was granted this interview. There was great excitement at CBS that we were getting this first interview after a drought, a quail drought. So 2 producers go with me, and I'm going to confess to you, they came to see the mistake he was going to make. Maybe he'd make 3 or 4. Maybe he'd have that deer in the headlight look that was so prominent during the campaign. So I get there, and we had 2 cameras, knee to knee. I'm right there. I ask him mainly about foreign policy, because that was his area when he was in the Senate. I, by the way, had him on Face the Nation when he was in the Senate, and he never had that look, and he always got through the programs without a mistake. That's probably why they chose me, because they knew we had done several interviews that had gone just fine. Well, you can imagine how ecstatic his people were when he got through this entire interview with me without a mistake. And I was in the room. I was, as I say, knee to knee. He didn't have that look. So his people were flying around, just elated, and of course we slumped out of there. What am I going to put on the air now? It's a confession to you. Because he didn't make any big news, it was that he didn't make a mistake, was the lead. Oh my God. But as I say, it was the first interview that he granted. We were going to put this on the air. It was an event. So if I get back to the office, I tell everybody there's no lead and there's no off lead. Oh dear. But I write a story. I'm tearing my hair out and I'm figuring out what to write. When I hear howls of laughter coming out of my edit room, because the producer, not the one who went with me, another one, is screening the tape with an editor just to help me see if they agree with me on what sound we were going to take. Not only is there howls of laughter, it's now crowded in there. Half the bureau's gone in to see this tape. And then people come out and tap me on the back and tell me I'm a kidder for saying I didn't get anything. So I get up and I go in, and he's on the screen, and the whole screen is his face, and of course there's the deer in the headlight. He's got that very look that we continued to see, by the way, through the vice presidency. What had happened, there's just no other explanation. The camera went in and grabbed it. You couldn't see it with the naked eye. I wasn't there, because I looked for it. It isn't that I missed it. I was looking to see if he had it on, right? He didn't. The camera went in, found it, and pulled it out. Now, I have no doubt that he was a nervous wreck with this interview. This was his first interview. he was concerned that he was going to make a mistake. But he had his game face on. And so I couldn't see it. The camera found it. The camera actually, I think, went in and found what was really happening on his face, right behind the mask. It wasn't a real thick mask, and it went in and pulled it out. So the camera never liked Dan Quayle. By the way, when he was writing his book, he called me about an interview he had done on Face the Nation, and I told him this story for his book, because I knew he would be talking about the problems he'd been through and looking for an explanation. And he didn't like my explanation. He wanted to blame the press 100%, and he didn't want to hear that the camera was doing something with his eyes. He didn't like that story. But here we have a camera that loves a John Kennedy and seems to dislike a Dan Quayle, loves a Ronald Reagan, and seems to dislike a Bob Dole. And so there is some alchemy out there between these inanimate objects, these mechanical cameras, and the candidates that contributes, again, to these little visual signals that go out from the television screen and affect us in an emotional way. When we see someone with deer in the headlights, we say, what's he so afraid of? And it's unsettling to us. I have been a student of all of this since 1972. Now, 1972, two big things happened in 1972. The first thing is that affirmative action passed in the broadcast industry. And the second, totally unrelated thing that happened is that CBS hired me. Completely unrelated. They also hired Bernie Shaw and Connie Chung. Also completely unrelated. And we were kind of the affirmative action babies at CBS. And my bosses assigned me to Watergate because, as Sean said, it wasn't much of a story. And so even though I was very young, they let me have it. And then it, of course, grew and grew and grew and grew. And finally went into the Senate, where there were full-blown hearings with Sam Ervin as the chairman. And in those days, the three networks put the hearings on in rotation. There were only three networks, so you had CBS would run the hearings live on Monday, and then ABC ran them Tuesday, and NBC ran them Wednesday, and then we started again with CBS on Thursday. When we didn't run them live, we did big primetime specials at night where we would excerpt the hearings, and at the end there'd be a 10-minute analysis by the correspondents. And my bosses came to me and said, are you ready to join the male veterans in the analysis? And I said, I lied, and I said I was ready. But the guys would never let me talk. I mean, it wasn't that they were deliberately trying to cut me out, but they were so busy arguing with each other about what this meant and that meant. So you'd hear me say, but don't you think, I agree, I did. And they'd just shout right over me, till finally there were so many complaints from people calling in and telegrams. We didn't have, we didn't have any faxes or ways to send email. It was all by phone or telegram, but we were swamped with this. So the bosses said to us, if she doesn't talk tonight, we're not doing this anymore. I knew I would talk, because all correspondents love to do analysis. Yet, for some impish reason, the moderator starts the analysis with the following. Well, folks, what's the gossip about John Ehrlichman? And I hear gossip, and I say to myself, let the guys gossip, and I'll do the next question. But they wait for me, because they've been told if I don't talk. So there's this horrible dead silence, which is excruciating on television, dead air. And it gets so bad that they actually physically turn into me. But I'm not going to do gossip. So Daniel Shore jumps into the breach and says, wow, if it's gossip you want, that's why we have a woman here. So how did I handle this? Really badly. Basically I wanted to hit him, so I couldn't do that. And I started to stammer and sputter and finally tried to get back to the question, but I forgot who I was supposed to gossip about. It was a disaster, a total disaster. And then I just stopped talking in the middle of a sentence and never said another word. Show ends, run upstairs, call home. Daddy, help me write a letter of resignation. I can never show my face around here or anywhere. It was just the worst thing, and they threw me the ball. I wanted it so badly, and I muffed it. And he said, "Oh, don't be silly. You were magnificent. I've never heard such thoughts, and you're smarter than they are." And on and on. I said, "Dad, I was awful, and if you can't be honest with me, put Mother on the phone." And my father said, "Mother can't talk right now. She's too upset." I told you my book is about a girl and her mother, and it really is. My mother's name is Dolly. She's all through the book because she does things like that to me at least once a month. And and a friend of mine finished the book and called me up and said, "You should have called her the Dolly Mama." That was great. So she really was a cheerleader more than anything else and wanted me to have this career. So she grabbed the phone finally and said, "You will not quit. No daughter of mine quits. You will go back in there and you'll be better tomorrow." And so anyway, I survived, and they did assign me eventually to the White House. And Jimmy Carter was the first president I covered. It was 1979, and he was a workaholic, as you all know, a detail man. And then, you know, he lost his election in '80, and Reagan came in, and here I had to get used to overnight a 9-to-5er. And in those days, when people said, when anybody said, "I slept with the president," they meant they'd gone to a cabinet meeting. It's funny. Thank you. We're talking Reagan here? Cabinet meetings? Reagan and his team had an almost exquisite sense of the importance of persona to the presidency and how they could promote the persona on television. And this I learned in 1984 during Reagan's re-election campaign. And CBS asked me at the end of the campaign to put together a long piece that would summarize the whole campaign. And I confess to you, it was a tough piece, and it was a very long piece, very long. It ran over 4.5 minutes, which on the evening news is like a documentary. But the theme of the piece was that his whole campaign was an effort to make the public forget some of his policies that had become unpopular. And I speak specifically about some of the budget cuts that he had proposed. Because we were beginning to get, well, we already had the homeless people, and he was cutting social programs. So those kinds of things were very unpopular in those days. So for instance, I had a vignette of him campaigning in Buffalo, New York, at a nursing home. He was inaugurating a new nursing home, but it was a campaign stop, so it had red, white, and blue everywhere, a huge flag behind him, balloons, kids, a band, the whole thing. The lighting on him was just perfect. He was handsome. And I said over all these glorious pictures, you would never know from these pictures that he tried to cut the budget for nursing home construction. And then you saw him at the same kind of political campaign event at a handicapped Olympics race or rally or something. And I said the same thing. And you wouldn't know from this picture that he'd try to cut the budget for the handicapped. And it went on and on and on like that. And I thought, God, they're going to hate this story. I'm never going to get a source in this White House ever again. But they called me up at the minute it ran and thanked me. It was Richard Darman, and he called me from inside the White House. Jim Baker was in the room. They had, I guess Lee Atwater was in the room, the campaign team, and they all shouted in unison, "We owe you big time." And I said, wait a minute. And they said, no, it was like free media right on the eve of the campaign, 4.5 minutes. It was fabulous. And I said, wait, didn't you hear what I said? And they said, nobody heard what you said. And I said, wait a minute. And then a click. And I knew he was telling me something big. And he said, you guys in television haven't figured it out. But when the pictures are compelling and the pictures are emotional and you say something that conflicts, the pictures will drown you out. They will override your message completely. And the pictures will prevail. And the public is only going to remember those great, glorious pictures of Reagan at a nursing home, Reagan with the handicap. In other words, it had the complete opposite effect of what my message was. Well, I knew it. I knew he was telling me the truth. But after the campaign, Martin Schramm, who was a reporter at the Washington Post at the time, covering the campaign, took my story to a focus group. I was in the room, and he ran it without my track. So you just saw the pictures and heard Reagan, and asked the people, 100 people, what that was. And 100 people said it was an ad for the Reagan Morning in America campaign. Then he ran it again with my track. More than half still thought it was an ad. They didn't hear me at all. And more than half of the rest said it was a positive news story. In other words, less than 1/4 actually heard me and got what I was saying. And now that story, the story I've just told you, is taught in journalism schools. Electronic, if you go and study television journalism today, you will study that story and what it meant. And after that, and after, gosh, everybody who wrote books about that campaign included that in the book somehow. Television reporters began to appear more on camera so that you weren't hearing what they were saying with pictures intruding, if the pictures didn't match perfectly. So if you watch television, you'll see more of reporters looking right at you than you used to before. Now, go back and I'm going to talk a little bit more, and then I'm going to stop because we want to have some questions. Go back to this last campaign, because I am now, because of that story and what I've seen since, convinced that the public is not as tuned in to what the politicians are saying about the issues as they are with how they say it and how they look when they say it. And I go to this last campaign, and I watched Bob Dole and Bill Clinton promoting their issues and what they were saying, and I believed that people just liked the way Clinton sounded and looked when he was campaigning. Paula Jones' harassment suit over a year ago. The president, Mrs. Clinton, had that to contend with, campaign finance allegations. They were drowning in scandal. This goes back over a year ago. Drowning in scandal, and for some reason, that's when the president's ratings start to tick up. At the beginning, I don't want to say the beginning because we were really in full-blown scandal. Of course, we've been in it for years, but this was really a height, and their ratings started to go up. This was in the days when Paula Jones first filed a harassment suit. So why did his ratings go up, and why have they stayed up? What changed? Well, you'll tell me it was the economy, stupid, and of course it was. But there was some other factor, and it has to do with television, and don't laugh at me, but I think it was Chelsea. And I say that because after years of shielding Chelsea from the press, and the press, by the way, one of our fine hours, agreed that we would not go and get pictures of Chelsea when she was going to Sidwell. Suddenly, now we're in full scandal mode, and we're seeing pictures of Chelsea with her father. We didn't see that before. Now it's father-daughter, the great loving pictures of him. We get great troika shots of Hilly and Billy and Chelsea. And you know, it was just like that helicopter business. The picture was so compelling. It said, we are a great family. And it was strong. We know they're a great family. I believe they are, but the picture was powerful. And you look at it, and this little judgment place that forgot that Reagan didn't know his grandchildren is saying, he couldn't be a womanizer. Look at what a great family man he is. And they fed us those pictures. He just came out of church with her. Was it the day after the impeachment vote or the day before the impeachment vote? I mean, he walked out of church, and she gave him that look, and he gave her that look, and you just said, wow. I mean, he's a great dad. I believe he is a great dad, but the pictures really sort of embedded in our minds. James Carville, as you all know, used to like to say that it was all the economy. It's the economy, stupid. That was the main thing. And I think he's got a really strong point, particularly in this economy when there's no inflation, the jobless rate's the lowest it's been in, gosh, I don't know, how many years? Keep reading a number forever and ever. The stock market is soaring. So obviously, the reason the president remains popular is the economy. But let me add a corollary to the Carville theorem and say that it's also television stupid. Now, I have a confession to make, and that is that I've never known how to end a speech. I mean, people should have a great rousing ender. It's television stupid doesn't quite get you there. So I believe you deserve a good ender. And so I'm going to wrap up with a story, a true story, that has absolutely nothing to do with anything I've just talked about. But it's a great ender, and you deserve it. So I went to a speech, much like this one, that Doris Kearns Goodwin gave on Eleanor and Franklin. And as part of her talk, she talked about the context in which they served in the White House, most particularly the lead up to getting into World War II. And she said that Roosevelt had called on the industrialists in the country, in many cases, to convert their heavy industries for the war effort. And the industrialists said, fine, but don't take our workers. Don't draft them. Because if you take our men, we might have to hire women. And women aren't ever going to be able to operate our heavy machinery because they're big and they just aren't going to be able to do it. But more importantly, if we have to convert, they're never going to be able to understand what it's going to take to convert. And if we're changing the machinery, and productivity will sink like a stone. And the worst thing is, it's going to hurt the war effort. But as time went on and we got into the war on two fronts, in Europe and in the Pacific, Roosevelt had no choice. He had to draft the men. And women, as we know, poured in all into industry everywhere, but most particularly into these heavy industries. And guess what? Productivity went up and up and up. And all the heads of these companies were astonished. I mean, really, they were completely baffled by this. They could find no explanation for it. So they went back to Roosevelt and asked him if he would send out economists and labor experts to study this and figure out what had happened. So Roosevelt did. He sent teams out. He sent them out all over the country to eliminate regional variabilities, and he sent them to different kinds of industry just to see if there was an across-the-board explanation. And of course, they produced one of your typical government-sized tomes, which, 4 volumes that ran up to the ceiling. But as Doris said, it all boiled down to a simple one-sentence explanation. The reason productivity went up when women went into the workforce was that women asked directions. Thank you, thank you, thank you. What's that?
Thank you very much, Lesley.
Thank you, Sean.
We are going to take some questions now, and make sure that you use your lungs, because we've got some microphones set up here on both sides, I believe. So we'd like to pick those comments up if we can. So here in the front row.
Yes, I enjoyed your talk very much, Lesley.
Thank you.
One very important 60 Minutes program in the first campaign with Clinton you did not comment on, and I believe it was very crucial. Your program has a reputation for asking very tough questions. But I think when Mr. Clinton and his wife came there at a crucial point in that campaign, you sort of threw softball questions at them, and I think that really helped him establish an image that he really was loyal to his wife, a good family man, etc. I wish you'd comment on that 60 Minutes program.
Okay, he's asking about the famous Steve Croft interview with the Clintons. It was I think, during the New Hampshire primary. Anyway, it was right when Jennifer Flowers was making her famous allegations that the president was a womanizer and had had some kind of long-lasting affair. And you said that we threw softballs at the president. Steve did. The Clintons certainly didn't think so. The Clintons were furious at 60 Minutes, and Hillary Clinton is still furious at 60 Minutes over that interview, which I happen to I'm astonished by that, because I agree with you. I don't agree that they were softball questions, and we can go through some of them in a minute, but they certainly did help him get elected. Hillary Clinton sat next to her husband and gave him that kind of Nancy Reagan adoring look, and said that they'd had some problems together, but that their marriage had come through it, and it wiped away whatever whatever the Jennifer Flowers effect was, and they went on to win the election. What the Clintons objected to at the time was that all the questions were about his sex life. It ran in the halftime of the Super Bowl. Everybody in the country saw it. I mean, there's no audience like the Super Bowl audience. That's it. So the whole country got to see the loving couple, that she supported him, and that it was whatever had happened, it was okay with her, and it wiped it away. They wanted to have questions about his education policy and all these other issues, and they were very miffed that he didn't get to talk about his issues, even though I think it got him elected and you think it got him elected. And they'd come here and tell you, if you think those were softballs, to them they were like knives being thrown at them. So they didn't understand how important and effective the interview was at the time. Yes. Oh, you point.
No, that's okay. Yes, you.
Okay, hi. Thanks for being here. This is very interesting. I have two questions. Stand up.
Yes, please.
Okay. Since your whole talk was about sort of images and the manipulation of opinion because of images on TV, I was wondering if someone in your position, if you have, if any, or what kind of influence you have within your position to have some say over what images are projected, working for one of the largest networks. And then my second question is what your thoughts are on the necessity to have a huge amount of money to run for office these days, especially president, and the inaccessibility of presidential candidates to show up on the major networks and express their points. Because as you're talking about these presidents you've covered, it's been very interesting, but there's also lots of other people running we, the American public, don't have access to unless we really research it. Thank you.
When you ask about the image, are you asking about if we have any effect on what the candidates do on television, that kind of thing?
First question?
Yeah.
No, I meant as a journalist, a renowned journalist, do you have any, or what is your power over what images are used and how, like during the Persian Gulf War, I personally was very disturbed by images I thought I saw on TV, like it was a game or something.
Yeah, we struggle with the question of whether we should always use what the government feeds us. And we debate whether, if we keep off the government handouts, to use your point about the Persian Gulf, if we just don't run them, aren't we censoring the government? And don't we have an obligation to show the public what the government is saying, or what the materials are that they're putting out, and then analyzing it and commenting on it? And I think we've chosen to go that route. Unfortunately, in the Persian Gulf War, reporters weren't allowed to cover the battle scenes. We were kept away. We were escorted everywhere. We could only go when, where, and how they chose to let us go. One of the few reporters who did go out on his own, without military escort, by the way, was Bob Simon, and he was captured by the Iraqis and put in jail. And it was a horrendous incarceration. But the whole question about manipulation, of course, is what reporters do. Whether it's an outrageous manipulation, and in many ways the way they forced us to cover that war was outrageous from our perspective, or whether it's just the daily White House briefing where they come before us and tell us that the president is the greatest person who ever lived and everything he's done is brilliant and magnificent and all the indicators are always going up. Our job, that's what journalists do, it's our role, is to try and get behind the handout. And of course we're loathed and despised by every administration we've ever covered for not just taking the meal they feed us, but that's our job. And when people say, oh, you're all so tough and you ask such horrible questions, I always think we're not tough enough. I think we should, in this democracy, be far tougher and question far more and doubt as much as we have to, because that's our function and our role, and it keeps the country strong. Now, the second question about the money, I mean, who isn't sick about a system where a person who runs for public office, runs to serve us, runs to get in a position that we elect him to, has to spend all his time raising money? It's disgusting. It's subverting the system. It's distorting it. It's turning us into a society where money matters more than anything else. Yeah, I don't know how we thread our way out of it, but we have to. And every time they pass a campaign law that tries to close up a loophole, someone finds a way out that's even worse. And we have just been sinking into a morass of this. Why don't we, I gather your question is, why don't we give them more free time on television? I'm not an executive at CBS, and I don't get to vote on that one. But the candidates appear, as we know, on Sunday mornings on the talk shows quite frequently, and of course that's free, and there's so many news outlets now. I think it's going to be very difficult for the candidates to argue they're not getting airtime. When you see MSNBC and CNN and CNBC and Fox and CBS, they're going to be able to come before the public. There is now today no, I say this sadly because I've watched the sort of splitting up of the great networks, and I find it distressing, but perhaps I have a vested interest in it, so I don't want to say that everybody should feel this way. But there's no one place anymore where people turn and everybody watches the same thing at the same time. I mean, even if the president speaks on television today, you can watch tractor pulling on ESPN. You can buy jewelry, and he's telling us something perhaps crucial. In the old days, if the president had a major announcement to make, you watched because there was nothing else to watch, and you were more connected as a citizen because you knew everybody else was watching, and it was what citizens do in a democracy. And that really is fraying, and it's distressing. So ask me a question when it's not depressing.
This gentleman on the front.
Lesley, I'm sure around your home in the evening watching the TV network news, there's some interesting discussions. But I think the quality of journalism has really suffered, and the ratings certainly show that too, even though, as you say, the audience has been dispersed. There are many more news outlets today. But what's your assessment of the quality of journalism today, whether it's Tom, Dan, Peter, of the three network newscasts?
Well, I really do think that the evening news really hasn't suffered. I think we're in a time where the stories themselves are not as compelling. We don't have the Cold War. Mike, do you know how many stories on arms control I did? We don't have arms control as an issue anymore. The economy is sailing. I did 10,000 stories on homelessness and recession and the deficit. We happen to be in this kind of strange, wonderful time when even the front page of the New York Times is filled with soft stories about basketball leagues and Michael Jordan. Today's front page is an example of where we are in the news cycle. So if everybody seems a little soft, it's kind of a good positive thing because that's the state of the nation. I don't think the evening news broadcasts have deteriorated, but what I do think is that with the competition, I'm talking about in general for news as you look across the landscape, with the competition that we've all felt and the stunning hemorrhage of audience for the networks, most particularly, with the cable, the radio talk show competition, with the splitting up and splintering of the audience, ratings have become the name of the game. Getting people to watch us is the most important thing, and they turn to surveys to find out what people want to watch in the news broadcasts, on these magazine news shows. What can we show that they will watch? That's one reason that sex is such a big story. People watch it. When I came into the business, it was 1972, so that's almost 27 years ago. I remember Walter Cronkite pulling me aside and saying that news is what your judgment tells you news is. News is what journalists decide is important. Never. I mean, the idea that we would go test the temperature of the public to see what you cared about, I mean, that was forbidden. Forbidden. That was not it. The agenda was very hard and very serious and very real. I find some of the magazine shows, I mean, somebody did something on antidepressants for dogs as a news story on a news magazine show in prime time. So yeah, if you look across the landscape, it's depressing. But there are the islands. I think the evening news is still strong, and I think 60 Minutes is still strong.
But in the corner over here, yes. Yes.
Yeah, CBS was once known as the Tiffany Network, especially during the days of William Paley. But even according to his biography, even Paley was very much bottom line oriented. Is it really a myth that CBS and all the other networks are much more money driven than they were, or is it just that they had better PR back then than they do now?
It's no myth. When I got to CBS, William Paley may have been bottom line about the network in general, but he pampered his news division. We used to, I'm not making this up. You can read it in my book, actually. We used to hire planes to take news people from news events and race us back to meet our deadline as though we were hailing cabs. We used to when I was covering the White House, I never really added up how many people would travel with the president, but we had 3 correspondents, 2 crews, an engineer, a radio technician. We had a morning news producer, a radio producer, and an evening news producer, and that was who, every time the president went anywhere, we all went with him. And now it's 1 correspondent, 1 crew, and probably not even a producer. The cutbacks started in the early 80s, and up until then, money was not an issue. Covering the news was the most important thing, and you spent what you had to spend. And from the early 80s on, they've been cutting back on personnel that I always thought were essential, but they say, no, you don't need to have an associate producer. They'd cut back on desk people. And I think when I got to CBS, I think these numbers are correct, there were 21 reporters in the Washington Bureau, and today there are 9. So it's not a myth. And what's happened is what this gentleman talked about, which is the proliferation of other outlets and the competition and the huge drop-off of the network's audience in general.
Let's try this side of the aisle. Yes, here.
Good evening. I had a question regarding your history in the media, and I'm sure you've witnessed this phenomenon that seems to be where when women reach a certain age, like as news anchors or reporters, they just seem to sort of disappear while their male counterparts keep aging, and they get older, and they're still, you know, on screen saying, that's the news, you know, or whatever. What do you foresee as the future? I mean, I know that you're reaching your golden years.
I can't say the word that's come to mind, but in the words of Barbara Bush, it rhymes with witch. Go ahead. Go ahead. Tit for tat, tit for tat. You know, let me stop you, because I totally disagree with you. I'm going to say a few words to you, okay? And then you can stand up and argue back with me, okay? Okay, you're listening? Barbara Walters, Diane Sawyer, Connie Chung, Lesley Stahl. I'm a little nervous about going much further. Jane Pauley. I'm not sure about Jane, but anyway, every one of those women, and I could go further, but I'm not sure on what side of the line, are over 50. And probably I could go deeper, I'm not sure. Certainly late 40s I could add. I don't think you're right. I don't think the women are leaving. And I think that the men suffer this problem just as much as the women. And in fact, I think that what's happened is it used to be that it was the women who had to be beautiful and perfect, and the industry has changed so that the men do too. And you tell me 3 more gorgeous men in the whole wide world than Tom Brokaw, Dan Rather, and Peter Jennings, can you? They're more beautiful than every woman I just named. So come on, come on.
Quite the end of my question.
Okay.
Now,
You know what? I think you need to watch out because her mother is going to call you.
Well, okay, now I was going to mention that I know of the cases that you were mentioning, and now, you know, it's very evident that women are, as you know, they get older, they are still, you know, reporting, and I mean, I think it's wonderful, and I think everyone here will agree with me that it is wonderful.
But you know, there weren't any till 72. I was in the first class, and we have survived, and we are aging on television. I've never bought that argument because it's always been made without examples. The women who were hired in the class of '72 are still there.
You're on thin ice. Very good. Yes, you in the front row. It's not a party until we break something, so.
Well,
That's a good luck, isn't it? Broken glass is good luck.
just getting back to this image problem again, or whatever you want to call it. My husband and I were here during the first inauguration of Clinton here at the Press Club. We sat and listened to Harry Thomason and Linda Bloodsworth go on and describe in great detail how they orchestrated his campaign up until the march over the bridge, the victorious, wonderful march during the inaugural proceedings, and how they, of course, also, orchestrated the inaugural proceedings, and laughingly said, well, we're not sure we want to spend the time and come back and do it again in 4 years, although we know we'll be asked to. And they talked in great detail about the whole campaign and their plan. Isn't there some way you can go beyond some of this phoniness and the plastic look at this to get into more of the character of the candidates, so we have some idea of what these people really are like outside of the makeup and everything else?
Did everyone hear? Okay. No? Yes? Yeah, it was all about, well, can't we get behind the manipulation so that these pretty pictures that we always see, the man from Hope and all of that. See, I think we did an enormous amount of character reporting on Clinton. After Nixon, and I think the press corps' lesson from Watergate was that we hadn't done enough character reporting. And we turned into a squad of people who were going after just that kind of thing. And I think the fascinating thing about Bill Clinton is that we knew everything. We certainly knew everything by this last election when we re-elected him. I think we did know his character. I think you could go back and find piece after piece. The womanizing, we certainly had heard about that. Bimbo eruptions, that we knew in the first. Remember, one of his aides, Betsy Wright, had told us about bimbo eruptions. We didn't care. So you have it laid out in terms of reporting. Now, about the manipulation, you go back to Jimmy Carter, walking down Pennsylvania Avenue holding hands with Rosalind in her glorious aqua coat. I mean, that kind of manipulation has been going on forever and ever with the kind of pictures I'm talking about. And no, I don't think there is anything we can do about it. I think that's part of being president today. I think part of governing today. And you may say it's awful, but it is. You know, it's not good, bad, or whatever. It is. Part of governing is sending out visual images to convey a message. And they're awfully good at it, all of them, or they wouldn't be president. And a reporter's job is to analyze what they're doing in terms of policy and try to get around it, but not run it. I think that is censorship, and it becomes very sensitive if you decide, you know, we're the press and we're not going to tell you what he did or said or whatever today. I don't know if I've answered your question. I just want to apologize for saying what I said, but I was trying to be funny, and I'm not sure it went over.
We have time for one more question, so Lesley, why don't you pick?
Oh, good. Oh, okay. Who's going to ask me the easiest question? Oh, you are? Okay. She said she was going to ask me the easiest question.
I just want to say I've enjoyed your books so
That's
much.
great.
That's a question.
But I'd like to say that obviously you overcame a lot of challenges as one of the affirmative action babies that you called them back in the 1970s. But I'd like to know what you think are the challenges that still exist today for women in the field, and then possibly what advice you could give students such as myself who aspires to be in your profession.
Well, I really honestly believe, and I say this from observation, that whatever challenges women face in journalism today, men face, that there aren't any differences, that we've won that battle, and that you have an equal chance of being hired and of being promoted, if you're good, as any man. And there will be no discrimination against you as a reporter or a producer or an editor in journalism. And there are women in the executive suites in news organizations. We're not presidents yet, but we're vice presidents, and we're going to be. So I don't think women need to think about that issue. That's a really old issue, in my opinion. There may be some sexual harassment in the workplace for women wherever they work, but that has nothing to do with journalism being any special place. My advice to young people coming into the business is, I only say two things. One is that you should start in a small place, because if you start in a big place, like for instance 60 Minutes, and they were to hire you fresh out of journalism school or after your first job, you'd be getting me coffee. And you wouldn't be learning much, because the way to become a journalist is to do it. Do you agree? Do it, do it, do it.
Yes.
Just go out there, find a story, gather the information, come home, write it. Next day, wake up, go out, find a story, and write it again. And that's the only way to become a journalist. So if you go to a big organization and you become, you know, the kid who Xeroxes, you're wasting your time. You want to go to the smallest place, because they'll have to use you. They won't have a choice. There'll be a big story and there'll be no one else around, and you'll get to go out and gather the information and come home and make a story out of it. And I wouldn't say I want to be in television, so I'm not going to be a print reporter. I'd take any job they'd give me in any of the media, because journalism is journalism, and what you want to do as soon as possible is start working at it. And the second bit of advice, and I guess this wouldn't just apply to journalism either, is work as hard as you can and send off signals that you'll do anything. You'll cover any story, you'll work late, you'll work early, just if they'll give you the chance to do the job. Thank you.